Thank you for joining us for this webcast this morning. Today's session will cover anatomy of a data breach. My name is Jim Gischak. I'm the chair of our data privacy and cybersecurity practice and the vice chair of our litigation department. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have during the program. For our participants who are watching the webcast, you're welcome to email your questions by clicking on the email link on your screen. So at the outset, we're going to start with some basics, and we would typically skip over these slides pretty quickly, but definitions have been changing, and talk a little bit about what's happening across the country and how the state statutes have been expanding the definitions of what constitutes personally identifiable information, the type of information that we need to be concerned about. Typically, when we talk about personally identifiable information, we're talking about an individual's last name and their full name or first initial, coupled with something like a social security number, driver's license, a credit card, passport, banking records, date of birth. But we're starting to see an expansion of this definition, and in particular, medical information. Medical information was added to the definition of personally identifiable information most recently on July 1st in Florida when they rewrote their statute, and as part of that expanded their definition of personally identifiable information. This is important because prior to this point, it was primarily your hospitals and physician practices that were worried about health information, and now they're expanding this definition. So to the extent you have your clients or yourselves happen to have medical information, for example, medical expense reimbursement information, workers' comp information, that type of information may very well be covered now by these state statutes. Some other interesting things: mother's maiden name and of course email and username in combination with a password or a security question and answer are also included in these types of definitions now. Next, we talk and you hear about PHI, protected health information. And again, we typically think of this in the covered entity context of your hospitals and physician practices. But the final rule, which came into effect in September of 2013, expanded some of this coverage down to business associates and sub-business associates. So we really do need to take a little deeper look into the chain of entities that are involved in handling health information. So just because a client may be an IT company or some other provider that's servicing a covered entity or business associate, they too may have to be complying with these regulations. So we want to make sure that we're taking a little deeper dive as to who's touching what information. Finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't at least talk about protecting, when we talk kind of holistically about protecting information, we want to make sure that we're protecting our business information as well. And we see this quite often in our cases, because we may get called on a trade secret theft case where an employee has left and taken information, and in the process they may be picking up and actually extracting personally identifiable or protected health information as well. Or conversely, somebody goes in, hacks in, or a rogue employee takes personally identifiable information or health information and also takes trade secret or confidential business information. So as we consider these issues, we want to make sure, again, that we're taking a holistic view, not only related to the individuals involved in an organization, legal, risk management, HR, IT, but also from a pure business, pure informational standpoint, that it's business information, personally identifiable information, and protected health information. Now, we often get asked, and we often hear comments from clients and prospective clients that we're not a retailer, we're not Target, we're not Home Depot, we're not Sony, so does this really affect us? And without question, if folks haven't realized it by now, this problem and this risk covers every industry. Unless you own a business with one employee yourself and you don't take any information, process any information, well, you don't have any risk except losing your own information. But that's not the case. What we find is companies across the board are all at risk. Now, certain companies have more risk than others, as you might imagine. Obviously, things like an accounting firm. that their job is to take in that type of personal information. Law firms, insurance companies, staffing companies, without question, of course, retail, anything health related, higher education, they gather quite a bit of information, colleges and universities. So it really doesn't matter what industry you're in. All that does is determine the level of exposure and risk. You're all at risk, of course, all of the clients are, but it's just a matter of at what level. So part of what we're trying to do, of course, is educate folks to the risk that's out there and the risk that they face. Now, as we talk about this, we also like to talk about the different types of data theft, because the theft that we typically hear about in the news and in the paper or on TV, it's the sexier incidents that sell media. So folks want to hear about, somebody that hacks in from a foreign country and millions of individuals have lost information. Those certainly sell the press, but that's a very small percentage of the number of breaches that we deal with and that are dealt with around the world. The majority of data breaches, although they might be on a smaller scale and they don't sell media, are much more simple. They're very simple. Typically, number one, physical loss. Lost or stolen laptops, PDAs, thumb drives, any other portable media containing personal information or protected health information. And we, of course, can't forget about hard copy. It's very easy just to think of this as an electronic issue, but we always have to remember that the hard copies also contain that same sensitive data. So this is, without question, the primary types of calls and primary types of breaches that we see. And the reason for that is really just human error. You can have all the policies and procedures in the world, which we would encourage you to do, because you will reduce some of your risk. You're not going to eliminate it. But the reason why you're not, in part, is because we are relying on employees to follow those policies and procedures, and human error is, without question, the number one issue that we have to deal with. The second type of data loss deals with the server breach, and this is what you would think of typically as the hacking situation. So you've got an unauthorized individual who accesses or hacks into a data server that stores personal or other sensitive data. So this is where, obviously, we're going to be focused more on the IT side of the house. The third is stolen data by an otherwise authorized user. This is a situation where we have an employee or a person with access who is authorized to have access. They download or send personal information or sensitive data to someone who is unauthorized or an unauthorized location, or they do so for an improper purpose. An example of this is either a couple good examples. One is the hospital situation. The movie star goes into the hospital in Hollywood, and someone working in the hospital wants to see why they're there, and they start snooping. So we get quite a few snooping cases where folks that are authorized to access information exceed their authorization because they want to look at information, or, again, they're doing something that they shouldn't. They may send it to their home, and that's a violation of policy. So it's very important that when we look at this, we think about the types of situations where this may arise. The last is the vendor or third-party breach, and we've seen a big uptick in the last few years. And as a matter of fact, if you're unaware, the Target breach, for example, was a result of a vendor. Their HVAC company, their vendor came in to service their refrigerator units, and when they plugged in their computers, the malware that was on the HVAC vendor's computers ran into the Target system, and unfortunately, as we all know today, penetrated their system and caused a very, very large headache for Target. So we need to make sure that our vendors are up to speed on protecting us from vulnerabilities, that they are not introducing something into our system. We also want to make sure that, to the extent, for example, we're using a third-party administrator, if we're providing the third-party administrator information, we need to make sure that they've taken appropriate safeguards. And one thing I always remind clients is, when you end any type of vendor or third-party relationship, obviously not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many times do you go back and look at your contract? Because typically there's a clause in there that when you end that relationship, they're supposed to destroy and confirm that they've destroyed or return your information. How often do folks really go back and do that? Unfortunately, I know the answer, and it's very rarely, and that's unfortunate because you have that protection in your contract. You should definitely use it. Next, just throw out some of the numbers here. So, we see this in the press every day, and we know it's a growing problem. Recent numbers of 931 million records, and a record can contain thousands of individuals' information. So the numbers are quite staggering. There are a number of websites out there that you can click on, and they literally show the numbers spinning like the national debt ticker. So there's a lot of information out there, but clearly this is a problem that is not going away, and the cost of this problem continues to rise. Recent study from Ponemon indicates the average breach cost $5.9 million. Now, is that every breach? Of course not. It's an average. And the reason why that number is as large as it is because you have breaches like Target that are in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, which pull up the cost of the smaller breaches. The smaller breaches are certainly still going to cost, $40, $50, $60, $100,000, but nowhere near $5.9 million. I think the more important number is $201 per compromised record. So they've averaged this out that they feel that given the number of records that get compromised, that on average, if you took that number of records, that number of individuals that are impacted, and multiplied it by 201, that should give you a pretty close number. But lots of things come into play and can complicate that simple mathematical formula, so you can't take that one to the bank. The most interesting point on this slide, I think, is that 75% of attacks are not considered difficult, and 90% are avoidable through simple or intermediate controls. And that's very important, and that's really what goes to the heart of preparation, policies, procedures, and training. If you and your clients are doing those things, you can dramatically reduce these risks. You are not going to eliminate them, no one can, but you can certainly dramatically reduce them. So we want to make sure that we're doing those things in the front end. And I should point out that the statutes across the country, they are starting to now require that entities be proactive and have these policies and procedures in place. Folks often ask us, as I was just talking about the $201 per individual in a breach, for cost, and they ask, well, how does that break down? So we'd like to throw this slide in simply just to show all of the different types of things that go into the cost of a data breach. Investigation and forensics, auditing and consulting services, different communications, inbound and outbound. Public relations, communications is critical in these types of events, as you've seen for those that have played out in the media. Of course, legal services, not inexpensive. Identity protection services, to the extent that Social Security numbers are involved, we always encourage our clients to offer some type of identity protection service. And then, of course, lost customer business, a very large number. And the problem is you may be losing business as a result of one of these incidents, but you may not know it. I just saw a recent survey where they had polled, I think it was 5,000 people, and they had asked them, well, would you have any hesitation going and shopping at these stores over the holidays that had suffered these very large data breaches? And it was interesting because about 46% of them said that they were most likely not going to shop at those stores. Now, we'll see when the Black Friday sales ads come out if they change their mind and opinion. I suspect that they will largely be driven by the deals that are out there, but at least the attitude and the mentality is people are thinking about shying away from businesses that have had these types of problems. So very important to make certain that A, we try to avoid them, but B, that we manage them appropriately. I mentioned lost business, and this gets to some of that, obviously, with reputational harm. In my prior comment, a recent study had indicated that 62% said breach notification decreased their trust and confidence in an organization. Well, not surprising, there's always been the question of, at some point, with all of the breaches that are out there and all of the notice, and coverage by the media, at some point does this get to be white noise? And I think that all of these various studies indicate that that is not the case, that this is not becoming white noise, that people's privacy and protecting their assets and protecting their identity and not being bothered with these issues is still very important to people. Going on, 15% indicated that they would terminate their relationship with the notifying company. 39% said they would consider it. 94%, this is interesting, 94% believed that the reporting organization was solely to blame for the breach. Now that's important because, for example, if one of your vendors has a breach, so for example, you take in data, whether it's employee data, customer client data, and you pass that along to a third party, a cloud provider, some other type of vendor, and they have the data breach. By law, you are the owner of the data and you are the one that needs to give the notice to all of the affected individuals. The vendor or cloud provider, the only obligation they're going to have is to notify you. Now you've got to go out and notify all these individuals. And what these statistics show is that 94% believe that the reporting organization was solely to blame. So even if it's a vendor that causes the breach, for the most part, people believe that whoever's name is on that letterhead, that it's their fault. So very important to be paying attention to that and to think about that when you're working on vendor agreements. 72% thought the organizations did a very poor job communicating and handling the data breach. And I think that, quite frankly, that number has increased post-Target. I don't think many folks thought that Target did a very good job of handling the breach and communicating it. And whenever you're in any time of crisis and you're dealing with either employees or customers, communication, consistent, honest communication is exceedingly critical. Now, when we talk about what our obligations are, it is a very complicated patchwork of state and federal laws that we have to consider and make sure that we are complying with. Now, we often get the question or comment that, well, I've only got an office or a business in Illinois or California or Ohio or Texas or Florida. Well, that's wonderful. But unfortunately, the law doesn't care, quite frankly, where you or your office is located. What the law looks to is the state of residence of the affected individuals. So the state of residence of the affected individuals. So for example, if you had 1 million customers and they were spread out all over the country or all over the world, and you had a data breach or an incident, we would have to look at all of the residents. Where do they reside? Every state of residence, countries, etc. So we've had many small breaches that may involve 120 people, but we've had to look to and apply the law of 30 or 40 different states. So currently, there are in excess of 35 federal statutes that deal with data privacy and protection. There are 47 state breach notification statutes. And again, I can't say it enough that it is the state of residence of the affected individuals that we have to look at. And all of those state laws are different. So it's important that you're dealing with someone that works on these matters daily, because they aren't going to necessarily know all of the nuances of all of these state statutes to make certain that you are kept out of trouble. Because if you don't comply with state statutes, the state attorney general, or if it's healthcare, the Office of Civil Rights, they will investigate and they will fine the entity that is not, in fact, in compliance. So as I mentioned, these states all have various statutes and they're all different. And even starting with the most basic premise of what is a data breach, these states are different. So for example, some of the definitions talk about there has to be an unauthorized acquisition, access, or use of personal information that's unencrypted, which comprises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of personal information and does not include good faith acquisition. So this definition can change dramatically from state to state. So once we figure out, well, what is a data breach, according to these various states, then we have to consider the next step, which is, well, do we in fact have an obligation to notify individuals under this particular statute? So an unauthorized acquisition of personally identifiable information that compromises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of personal information. And then the states get different as to the triggering mechanism and the triggering language. So for example, in Indiana, if in fact that unauthorized acquisition results or could result in identity theft or fraud, then you have to provide notice. In New Jersey, for example, so if it's unauthorized acquisition or access of personal information, you have to notify unless there's no misuse of personal information that has occurred or is not reasonably likely to occur. Now, you can see that the words that are used in these definitions can be fairly subjective. Words like reasonably, there we get into a bit of interpretation, and you have to be careful how you interpret that, and you certainly have to know your audience. How is the regulator going to interpret that if they come in and investigate you? So these are all things that you have to take into consideration. In Florida, for example, you have to give notice unless there's no reasonable likelihood of harm to a consumer whose personal information was acquired, has resulted, or would result, in fact, in some harm to them. So these are all the different types of definitions that we have to consider. In Michigan, for example, that has caused or is likely to cause loss or injury to a resident. So you can see that in all of these states, they define this a little bit differently, but you have to take those nuances into consideration. Now, I mentioned there are changes with the Healthcare Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, the HITECH Act. Much easier to say high-tech. The HITECH Act, the final rule in the HITECH Act, it's now gone into effect, and that went into effect in September of last year. And the reason why this was so important, really there were a few dramatic changes. First, it impacts covered entities, what you would normally think of as a covered entity, your hospitals, physician practices. It also affects business associates, so other businesses that support or work with and or for those covered entities, as well as subcontractors that perform functions that would involve the use or disclosure of protected health information. Now, under the final rule, business associates are directly liable for compliance. So Health and Human Services can come in and investigate a business associate directly, which before they were not able to do so. Business associates now need business associate agreements with their sub-business associates or their vendors. So again, the rules are trying to push everything downstream to make sure that business associate agreements, which many folks may be familiar with and have signed in their businesses, that they're now pushing those downstream to their vendors that in fact have and touch confidential information. The rule also requires that you have an incident response plan and privacy policies and training. Those all need to be updated. We need to make certain that you in fact have all of those policies in place and that they've been updated. And business associates are now also subject to HIPAA audits. So business associates have much greater exposure under the final rule. The final rule also imposes notification requirements if there's a breach of unsecured PHI. The prior breach standard dealt with the risk of harm, and it's interesting. So now there's a presumption of a breach, whereas before there was a financial or reputational analysis that was conducted. Again, very subjective. And what Health and Human Services was doing here is taking the subjectivity out of this. So now the new breach standard, there is a presumption of a breach, but once you presume there's a breach, then we have to go through a 4-factor analysis. Now, after you do that, and if you determine, well, we do have to provide notice, the covered entity or business associate must provide notice within 60 days of when the breach is discovered. If there are more than 500 individuals impacted, They must give notice to Health and Human Services immediately, and if there's 500 or more from any one particular state, they have to provide media notification. So this gets tremendous exposure very quickly if there's over 500 in one state. A couple of other statutes that I do want to mention. First is ITERA, the Identity Theft Enforcement and Restitution Act. The reason why we mention ITERA is prior to ITERA, many of these cases were very quickly being dismissed. So now one of the hottest areas in class action litigation, of course, it deals with data privacy and security. Individuals were bringing these cases and they were alleging that they were harmed as a result of their information being compromised. And what was happening is the defense attorneys, like myself and our team, we were getting these cases dismissed, stating that the individuals did not suffer any economic harm, and that is a required element in order to keep the case alive. And so the cases were being dismissed very early on. ITERA came in and essentially states that your time, the time you spend remedying the situation, remedying identity theft, the time you spent has value. So now what's happening is the legislators are saying they are going to attach a value to your time. So now the debate is, well, what number should that be? But what it's doing is it's potentially precluding cases from being dismissed immediately on summary disposition, because now they can say, well, they have suffered damages in that they spent time dealing with the situation, and pursuant to ITERA, their time has economic value. The next is the FTC Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 5A. The FTC, the SEC, all of these regulators have gotten very active in this area. The FTC's approach has been interesting. They are going after entities for violating their privacy policies, but their tact has been that it's an unfair and deceptive trade practice. So one of the things that they're doing is, for example, they are looking at web pages and at privacy policies that are on the first page or second page or somewhere on your website. So they look at your privacy policy, and you say, entities say things in their privacy policy, but they don't always then follow through and do those in practice. So the privacy policy sounds great, but they just forgot to implement or just don't implement and follow those policies. What ends up happening is the FTC says, well, that's an unfair and deceptive trade practice, and they come in and they fine. So we really do need to make sure we have appropriate policies, procedures, but we have to follow them. Very critical that you follow them. I'll mention quickly credit cards. So PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which was established back in 2004, and of course all of the major credit card companies are part of PCI. And what this requires, of course, is any merchant that's accepting credit or debit cards that they comply with this private standard. So it's very important that to the extent you're dealing with clients that accept credit cards, that they're paying attention to and making certain that they are PCI compliant. The breach notification statutes under PCI are much different in that the time to provide notice to the credit card issuers, Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover, the time shrinks down dramatically. So for example, with Visa, within 3 business days of a reported compromise, Visa requires that you provide them with a written documentation, an initial investigative report. And I'm not going to go through all of the details, but what you'll see is that it's something that has to be done very quickly, and there's quite a bit to do if there is a suspected or known credit card breach. MasterCard requires within 24 hours they be notified and on an ongoing basis. So again, it's very critical that clients are moving quickly to identify these threats and report them appropriately. Stepping out of the private standard of PCI and going to the state statutes. So I mentioned that there's a patchwork of statutes out there. 47 states have these breach notification statutes. The true gold standard is Massachusetts, and Massachusetts came online in March of 2010. And Massachusetts really rewrote everything because Massachusetts has a very long laundry list of things that you need to do to comply with their statute. And I'm not going to go through all of them because we could spend a day just talking about those requirements, but I will hit a few highlights. The first thing is that any entity, doesn't matter where you're located, doesn't matter where you do business, any entity that owns, licenses, receives, stores, maintains, processes any personal information of a Massachusetts resident has to develop, maintain, and implement a written information security program. Now, this may sound more daunting than it is. The summary is about a 7 to 8 page document, but in there it does talk about things that you're doing to reduce risk and protect information, like training programs. It may define with your computer systems, how quickly do they log themselves off? How many times, how often do you have to change your password? So this written information security program, even if you're not legally obligated, from a best practices standpoint, you certainly should consider having one of these. All of our clients should. Next, third-party service providers. We have to make certain, every entity has to make certain, that the third-party service providers that they are working with that could potentially access this information, by contract, that they are implementing and maintaining appropriate security measures. So what does that mean? So you have information on Massachusetts residents, and you are now working with an IT company or a third-party administrator or a cloud provider that could have access to that Massachusetts individual's personally identifiable information. In your contract, you need to make certain that they are representing, that they are implementing and maintaining appropriate security measures. So we need to make sure, again, back to contracting, that you have all of the elements in those contracts that you need. The other thing that Massachusetts did, which was very sweeping, is that Massachusetts requires that any electronic device, any portable electronic device that contains information on a Massachusetts resident, it must be encrypted. Not possibly, not maybe, it must. So to the extent you have portable electronic devices, make sure they are encrypted, and make sure that the password is not taped to the device or put in the bag. You may be chuckling, but at least half of the time when we get calls about theft or lost devices, and companies think they're in great shape because the device was encrypted, we discover that the password was actually taped to it or in the bag. Again, this just goes to training. Florida, I mentioned Florida briefly earlier. Florida, as I mentioned, just came online July 1 of this year with their new statute. And their new statute, it's certainly not to the level of Massachusetts, but it is definitely ratcheted the bar up a bit. And in listening and talking to legislators, it seems like more of them are gravitating towards the Florida model than the Massachusetts model. So what did Florida change? Prior to the change, July 1, you had 45 days to notify affected individuals. Now there's 30 days. So Florida is actually shortening the time frame you have to notify affected individuals. As I mentioned, Florida also expanded the definition of personally identifiable information to include passport number, medical information, email, username in combination with password or security question and answer. So they're expanding their definition, and they now require that the Florida Attorney General receive notice if there are 500 more records of Florida individuals that are affected. The Florida AG also now has a statutory right to ask for a police report. So to the extent you get a police report, they may be asking for that. They can also ask for forensic reports. Now this is critical because we always instruct our clients, we want to make sure that the lawyers are hiring these third-party vendors. So if we need a forensic firm to come in and do work, we want to hire them so that we can preserve the attorney-client work product privilege as best we can. If the client hires them directly, there is no privilege, and all of that's discoverable. Now, why is this important in part? Because these forensic folks may find vulnerabilities in your system. And if they turn that report over to the AG's office, you know, anybody out on the street could file a Freedom of Information Act request and get that information. And now your vulnerabilities are exposed to the world. So we want to do everything we can to keep that from happening. We've also had instances where the forensic firm comes in to do its investigation, and during the course of its investigation it finds other issues on someone's system that may have legal ramifications. And we want to just make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect that investigation. Florida also now requires proactive measures, and as I mentioned earlier, we're starting to see that more with states, that they are by law requiring you to do certain things. In this case, take reasonable measures. Now, unlike Massachusetts that is very specific, Florida just says take reasonable measures. Well, we work quite a bit with the Florida AG's office, so we have a pretty good sense of what they're looking for, but being proactive, again, is critical. Vendor notification. So this is a very nice part of this statute. It requires vendors that experience a breach to notify the party that gave them the data. They have to notify them in 10 days. Remember, the clock starts to run when they discover that there's a breach. There is a limited federal exemption in the statute. If a covered entity actually notifies individuals under its applicable federal notification statute, for example, under HIPAA and HITECH, it's exempt from the Florida Act. But again, you need to be careful because the exemption is only going to apply if, in fact, notice was provided under these other statutes. And again, even if you're exempt and you don't have to send out notices under Florida, you still have to notify the Florida AG's office of the breach. So we couldn't go talking data privacy without at least mentioning Target for a few minutes. Target, let's take ourselves back, almost a year. Last holiday shopping season, the news story was broken, not by Target, but by a third party. On December 19th, that Target had a breach. 40 million individuals were affected during a very limited time period. On December 20, Target came out, their CEO, and said, we've worked swiftly to resolve the incident. There's no indication of any impact to PIN numbers. Now, the reason why everybody was worried, of course, about debit cards and PIN numbers is from a consumer standpoint, if your credit card is stolen, you aren't going to be on the hook for any liability for the most part. Typically, no liability to the consumer. However, if a criminal got your debit card and your PIN number, they could go in and drain your bank account. Now, if there's fraudulent activity, most likely your bank is going to give you the money back, but that could take a while while they investigate. So debit cards, I'm not a big fan of. On December 27th, Target comes back to the press and says, well, we've discovered a few more people that have been affected, to the tune of 70 million people. Additional people were affected, bringing the count up to 110 million. And now, for the first time, they admit that PIN data was compromised, and it includes shoppers from the last 10 years. So this problem for Target truly started to mushroom and get wildly out of control. Now, what was the effect of that? Well, the number's old. Many class actions, many over 35 now, have been filed. Some of the more interesting lawsuits that have been filed, for example, the shareholder derivative actions that have been filed against the officers and directors of Target. And the allegations that are made in those lawsuits are interesting. And if they prove to be true, will certainly be problematic for Target and for their executives. In there, there's allegations that Target was holding off on going public with this because they wanted to get through their shopping season. Not surprisingly, the last 30 days pretty much, or 45 days of the year, is where they make a very large percentage of their revenue. So the allegations are that they were holding off until after the shopping season to let the world know that they had a problem. Another interesting aspect of this is the cost per card. So to replace all those $110 million credit cards, the average estimated cost is $5.10 per card. So you're over $500 million just in card replacement. Very big number. So you might imagine they're being investigated by everybody, the Secret Service, the Department of Justice. There have been Senate hearings. Now their stock initially fell 10.5%, but I know it's been creeping back up. Target is an exceedingly strong brand and obviously is able and has been able to withstand this type of major blow. Most entities would not. But they did have to do some things to cover the books because of the stock price falling and revenue falling. So certain things that happened around this time, healthcare coverage was cut for part-time workers, 475 workers were laid off, and over 700 open positions were eliminated. The CEO, not surprisingly, and CIO resigned, and many attorney generals are also involved in this investigation, which again just continues to grow. I always like to throw in real-life examples because I think that's the easiest way to relate to all of this. And I've talked about third-party vendors. We've had a number of low-tech theft of paper, in particular anything to do with SOCIAs, tax returns, things like that. Talk about unnecessary notification. You know, I've talked quite a bit about these deadlines and how quickly clients need to move. They need to move quickly and efficiently, but they need to move smartly, because we've seen situations where folks had gone to the media and gone on TV and talked about the data breach they incurred. For example, one was with a stolen laptop, and lo and behold, the next day they found the laptop, and forensic exam was run on that, and it was determined that no one had ever turned on it, the laptop, opened it, done anything with it. So there was no need to go to the media and do all of what they did, which unfortunately cost them a little over $1 million to remedy that situation. So even though we need to act quickly and decisively, we want to be smart about it. One of my favorites is the thumb drive bowl. This was some young entrepreneurs, criminal entrepreneurs in New York that came into one of the tall skyscrapers and put a very large bowl of thumb drives on the security guard's desk. And their story was, hey, we just opened a computer store down the street. We want to give away promo items to generate business. Security guard said, okay, fine. You know, put them up here and we'll make sure that people take them as they come and go. Well, as you can imagine, many of the individuals walking in and out of that building took these thumb drives. And they started to realize that they were all having problems. Somebody was hacking into their computers at work, at home, and the buzz got around the building, and ultimately it was determined and investigated, and they realized that what happened was those thumb drives contained a program, a malware program. So when you plugged it into your computer, it gave access to the two enterprising gentlemen that brought in the bowl of thumb drives. So it's a great point, because how many times do we go to conferences or elsewhere and we get a thumb drive and we take it and we use it? Well, before you do that next time, have somebody in IT take a look at it, make sure that there's nothing on it so that you don't run into the same issue either at work or at home. So you want to make sure that that's being looked at. For those that think that this is a problem that can just be solved through IT, the company that makes the rolling encryption codes, they got hacked into about 3.5, 4 years ago. So there is no bulletproof defense when it comes to this. It's trying to eliminate as much risk as you can, build that wall, but then also take care of the preparation, you know, being able to respond, which we'll talk about shortly. The ransomware attacks, we've been getting quite a few of those lately. You know, you get the email, you click on it, it says, we've encrypted your computer, pay us $100 and we'll make it go away. Do not pay the $100. Talk with IT, talk with professionals about that. You may have to even talk with the FBI. We spend a lot of time with the FBI, Secret Service. You know, we bring them into cases. to make sure that they're up to speed as to what's going on out in the world. And they are an extremely valuable resource. They can bring some great resources to bear, and we want to take advantage of them wherever it's and whenever it's appropriate. Something else that has become a little more popular with the regulators is coming after companies that are retaining data. So we all do it. We're all pack rats. And what happens is, in business, somebody in the organization always feels like we have to hold on to every file because somewhere down the line we're going to need it. So what happens? Well, in the older days, we would ship everything off to Iron Mountain and we'd get the giant bills every month for storing things with Iron Mountain. Unfortunately now, it's gotten a lot less expensive and easier because what do? Well, we just go out and we grab another server and we just throw more data on it, more data. And the problem is every company is saving data that it does not need to save. There is no legal rationale to save all of this data. So what happens? There are, I believe, 31 states now that have breach, destruction, and disposal statutes. And essentially what those say is, to the extent you've got data and you no longer need it for a legitimate or reasonable business purpose, you have to destroy it. And you can't just throw it in the trash, you have to destroy it appropriately. But if in fact you do not need to retain this data, you should not be retaining this data. So let's make sure that we all go back and we all talk to our clients and customers and we say, hey, these are record retention, these types of policies, doing them the right way. This is really critical. It's going to reduce exposure and it's going to get us compliant with the law. So again, if companies violate this, there can be fines and penalties and they can get substantial very quickly. We also caution folks, when we get the call, people are usually fairly panicked over the situation. Lots of emails have been flying in the organization, phones are ringing. We always caution everybody, don't use the B word. Don't use the word breach. The word breach actually has legal significance. So what we tell folks is use the word incident, because until the expert lawyers tell you that you have a data breach, you just have an incident. And there are many cases that we work on that we investigate and ultimately come to the conclusion it is just a mere incident. There is no breach. We do not have to send notice to everybody. Now, if you are all running around saying, oh, it's a breach, it's a breach, it's a breach, some regulator is going to look at that a little differently. So, and we don't want the clock to start running. So let's at least just use the word incident to start, and let's avoid email. Not a big fan of people emailing all these concerns around, so let's avoid email. So I've talked quite a bit about proactive measures, and some of them, and we mentioned the Written Information Security Program earlier that's required by Massachusetts and some other regulatory statutes here. But an incident response plan. Do the clients have an incident response plan? And I've seen very elaborate incident response plans, and I've seen incident response plans on literally a cocktail napkin. So typically the appropriate plan for clients falls somewhere in between. So, part of our job is to talk with clients and to figure out their culture, how they work, how they think, and take that information and put that into and draft a customized incident response plan for them. And that is really critical, because when you do have the problem, the first thing you want to do is go to that plan, go to that document that lays out what the next steps are. Also, from a proactive measure, confidentiality agreements. We should have updated confidentiality agreements that define PII and PHI. And these updated agreements need to be signed by everyone in the organization. Everybody should be signing a confidentiality agreement. Training. More and more we're seeing the regulators wanting us to have trained our employees. Doesn't have to be very elaborate, not 2, 3, 4 days. It could just be an hour. So once a year you have an hour of training. I know here at McDonald Hopkins, We are, as you might imagine, very much on top of this, and we make certain that every one of our employees, from our president down, goes through annual training so that they are aware of these issues. If you don't practice in this space, you're not going to be thinking about it all the time. So training is really important. Lastly, we encourage folks to do a data privacy and network security review. And what that is, and it's free. If anybody, we may just blast it out to everybody on the webcast here. But what it is, it's a 50-question questionnaire. And it just causes folks to think about, to ask questions and think about where might they have exposure, what should they be thinking about. It's a great starting point to break the ice and get folks thinking about this. And of course, as part of that, we're asking, do they have insurance coverage? If they don't, we always tell clients, this is like every other business risk. You have to evaluate it the same way. Even though it's more intangible, you have to evaluate it the same way. So you need to determine, do I need insurance? Do I not need insurance? And you're really going to have to look at the big picture and have an understanding of what your exposure is. But this review will certainly go a long way in helping folks come to those conclusions and identify where they have risk. An incident response team. We encourage every client to have an incident response team, so when there is an incident, you have the core group, the few key players, representatives from legal, IT, HR, risk management, marketing, PR, compliance. We want to have those people as part of a team and that they know they're part of a team. And you're going to want to have in that incident response plan, you're going to want to identify your team and you're going to want them to be very familiar with the plan. Very important that they're familiar with it. And that plan is really your go-to document. I mean, that is when you have an issue, you go look at that document and it tells you what to do step by step by step. So some of these things on a very, very high level, broad picture. This document's going to discuss notification and escalation. It's going to talk about preserving and gathering evidence. It's going to identify your resources. In that document, we identify who from the organization is involved, but what about external resources? Who are the vendors that you've already talked with? You don't want to be searching for vendors on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve or any other holiday, Thanksgiving. What we want to do is we want to know that we've got our vendors in place prior to that happening. And then finally, you want to test your response. We spend a lot of time educating clients and conducting tabletop exercises with them. And it truly is a phenomenal way to do it because folks get to live through this process without actually having to go through an actual breach. So let's talk about what do you do if there's an incident. Well, we always tell our clients the first thing you want to do is to notify your carrier, to notify all of you, notify the brokers and carriers, because it's critical from as you all know, from a coverage standpoint, that folks are thinking about and notifying the brokers and carriers. Next, you want to get legal involved. You want to loop in counsel because you want to maintain that privilege that we talked about. You want to get your incident response team together. So who are those core group of folks that are going to help make decisions about this? And then who's your spokesperson? Who is the coordinator on your end that's going to make sure these things are getting done? Critically, we want to make sure that we're preserving evidence. IT may want to get in and go through the system, but we really want to kind of lock it down because if we get a computer forensic company in, they may be able to come in and tell us a little bit more about what happened. If we start to step on, if you will, the data or metadata, then we run into problems because what happens is we may have been able to figure out something before a certain date, but gee, now after a certain date we can't do it. So we want to make certain that we are preserving our evidence. We want to determine as we're going what action, if any, needs to be taken. Should we be contacting law enforcement? If it's a theft or a break-in, of course, we're contacting local law enforcement. Do we need to bring in federal law enforcement? And again, I can't say it enough, we need to look at the residents of the affected individuals. Do we need to provide them credit monitoring, or do we want to provide them credit monitoring? We'll be sending letters, we get asked often, how do we send these letters? Well, when we go through the letters, they have to have the appropriate language to comply with the law. So once we get an appropriate letter together, then they are sent U.S. mail directly to the individuals, or, depending on the size of the matter, we'll work with a mail house. Anything over really 150, I would tell you, you want to use a mail house because they're experts in doing this every day. And it can't be screwed up because the codes get matched up with the letters, etc. So it really can become a large, cumbersome project. We will be communicating with crisis communications folks, either internal or external at that time, preparing frequently asked questions. We'll provide appropriate notifications to the state attorneys generals or other federal regulators. Appropriate reporting to credit card companies. If credit cards are involved, we need to report to the credit card company. So when there's an incident, there's a few things we need to figure out right away. Who is involved and where do they live, and what is the information that was involved? That is really going to drive the bus here, determining which paths we go down. And then a call center. Folks are going to have questions. So typically we'll set up an external call center, but there will be escalations that bounce up to the company. So we need to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that everybody has the same speaking points, etc. But we work with clients as they get those escalation calls. We work with them to work through them and make certain that whoever's calling and is upset feels taken care of after that call. So we often get asked, okay, you've just buried me. That's a ton of information. What do I do now? So we always tell folks, well, assemble an incident response team. At least know who are the core players that are actually going to be responding and dealing with the situation. Draft the incident response plan. We draft these every day. It's important to us to make sure that there's an appropriate plan for clients given their size, the information they take in, etc. Engage vendors. Well, it's calm. Know who you're going to use. Make sure your clients are aware of, who would they use for an attorney, for a forensic firm, for a mail house. If they have insurance, ask if they have insurance, or if they're buying insurance, depending on the carrier, they're most likely going to have a panel of approved counsel. So these are the type of questions that we need to be asking. Again, I would encourage everyone to have their clients complete this data privacy review. It is a great free tool to help maximize you and the clients, and to put them in a position that they are going to feel more comfortable. And quite frankly, as they go out and are trying to get insurance or renew their insurance, having gone through this process can certainly not hurt during renewal time. Make sure that they've identified who has access to PII and PHI. Make sure there's appropriate policies and procedures in place. Again, critically, vendor contracts. Make sure that the vendor contracts are up to date, and make sure that we've got confidentiality agreements in place with all of our employees, vendors, anyone that's going to come in contact with or access this confidential information certainly should have signed a confidentiality agreement. I know this is a tremendous amount of information. I would like to thank everyone for their time this morning. It is a very timely and a very hot topic. We promised that we'd end at noon. We're right on the button. If you have additional questions, you can email those questions and we will respond back to you. I think if you'd like that questionnaire, maybe I'll just blast it out to everybody that signed up, and if you want it, great. If not, delete it. But again, it's a very useful tool. We continue to follow, obviously, the latest developments in this space regarding privacy and cybersecurity. One of the ways that we communicate this information to our friends is on our online community called the Business Advocate. The URL is on the front page of your handout. You can tune into the Business Advocate for follow-up Q&A and a replay of today's event. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives about the topics that have been discussed here today. We will also be emailing out a survey requesting feedback. Obviously, any feedback you can provide would be much appreciated. And again, we thank you for joining us and have a wonderful holiday.